Here we go. All right. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's program, 9/11 and the Aftermath of Mass Tragedies. My name is Amy Lousteau, and I'm the Community Outreach Librarian here at the Belmont Public Library. Thank you all for being here, and to the Friends of the Library for helping make this event possible. I invite you all to get in touch with me with any questions or program ideas, and I'll put my email address and phone number in the chat. We also have a survey, so please fill that out anytime during or at the end, and I'll put the link to that in the chat as well. Just to note again, we'll be recording tonight's session, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to put your questions in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll start with those. And also, Kate just told me that she's okay with you raising your hand or putting a question in the chat as we go, and I'll get her attention and let her know that there's a question. All right, so without further ado, Dr. Kate DeConinck spent 5 years conducting an ethnographic study about the aftermath of 9/11 in New York City. In this presentation, she will share insights from her fieldwork with an eye towards what this past tragedy can teach us about the present, hoping to address questions such as, how do we move forward collectively and individually from events that have shattered our everyday lives? What types of rituals, modes of storytelling, and other practices do people find helpful in the wake of a mass tragedy? Dr. DeConinck teaches in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego. She is trained as an anthropologist of religion and specializes in the role that religion plays in the wake of mass tragedies, such as 9/11 and the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. For the past 2 years, she has also served as a co-director of USD's Urgent Challenges Collective, Homelessness Initiative, which supports research, teaching, and advocacy on the issue of homelessness. Dr. DeConinck designs and oversees the collective's programs and has also participated in research studies on topics such as mourning, grief, and homelessness. She is also a co-chair of the Teaching Religion Unit of the American Academy of Religion. I'm sure most of us who were old enough, which is probably everyone here, remembers where they were on 9/11, and it's had a lasting impact not just on our foreign and domestic policy, but our culture and our psyche as well. Please help me welcome Kate DeConinck.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Amy. And thank you all for showing up at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night to be here, for this talk with me. As Amy said, my name is Kate DeConinck, and I'm going to be talking to you tonight. I'm going to backtrack on my slides for just a second here. Go back to slide number 1. So my topic for tonight is thinking about 9/11 and the aftermath of mass tragedies. Like Amy said, I would love for this event tonight to be as conversational as all of you would like it to be. If you feel like you just want to kind of listen in and chime in the chat or things like that, that's perfectly fine. If you would like to interrupt me at any point in time, though, and ask questions or engage in deeper ways with what I'm sharing, I would certainly welcome and love that too. So yeah, Amy provided this great introduction to who I am and a little bit about my background. She mentioned that I'm teaching at the University of San Diego as my primary affiliation right now. I also teach online courses for United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities and also now for Springfield College in Massachusetts. And so my primary affiliation is with departments of religious studies. So I teach courses on world religions, on the history of religion in America, and so on and so forth. Like Amy said, I'm trained as an anthropologist of religion, and my expertise is in religion in the wake of mass tragedies. What you'll see tonight, though, is I'm interested in questions that go beyond kind of conventional definitions of what we think of when we tend to think of religion in our culture today. So I'm not just looking at how do Muslims respond to something like 9/11 or how do Catholics respond or Jews or kind of other religious groups, right? I'm also very much interested in the kind of broader strategies that individuals and groups might call upon as they try and create meaning in their lives in the wake of something that shattered their kind of everyday realities. the ways that people try and foster more viable lives for moving forward from a particular event. And sometimes that happens in places that we might consider to be conventionally religious, and sometimes it doesn't, right? So we have many spaces for meaning making in our world today. And a lot of my fieldwork has centered around museums and other sites of memory where not only religious communities, but all sorts of different people from across elements of a community might come together to try and make meaning. Okay. So with that in mind, as Amy said, I did want to start tonight with a little bit of an invitation just to share. So you'll be hearing plenty from me tonight. I'll be sharing all sorts of images and ideas from my field work and things I've been thinking about recently in relation to COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic and some of the strategies that we're seeing people work through or think through in the present moment. But first, I just wanted to give a little space for maybe a minute or so for all of you to share things that you might have noticed this month, locally or personally or in the national news, in terms of thinking about the ways that the 20th anniversary of 9/11 has been remembered and kind of commemorated in recent times. So if there's anything that you want to share, I'm just going to kind of be quiet for a few seconds and see what people might like to share in the chat. If there were things that you noticed happening anywhere really in your life or in the news, I would just love to see what sorts of things are part of your collective awareness when it comes to the ways that we have kind of been memorializing this month. So I'm going to be quiet for maybe like 30 seconds to a minute, which might feel like a really long time. But as I always tell my students, that's because I'm giving you time to think and write if you're interested in doing so. Okay, so I'll set a timer for about 45 seconds to a minute, and then we can just kind of look at one another's responses. Okay. Great. So we'll take another 10 seconds or so. If there's a thought that you'd still like to share, you can kind of finish up what you're writing and put that in the chat for us. All right, so I'll count down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and as I'm sure all of you have been doing, I've just kind of been scrolling through to see what sorts of things you've all been mentioning, right? So some of you have been thinking about the anniversary in the context of religious communities that you might be part of. So hearing from church friends about different ceremonies or commemorations that are taking place. Some of you actually had memorial services at the places where you've worked. Also some collective awareness about, presidential activity during this 20th celebration or 20th anniversary, thinking about where President Biden was kind of moving on that day. Some communities have also opened up spaces for communal reflection and a place for people to share stories. So it sounds like in Belmont, the firefighters were able to be honored in that context. In my own community, I drove past a couple of local memorials and just saw a lot of families kind of out at those spaces. Some of them were putting flags on different sites and kind of marking things in what seemed to be these intimate family settings. Good. We're also seeing some personal stories from children who lost parents on 9/11. And then thinking about the news coverage on this day as well on the 20th anniversary, and maybe doing a little comparative thinking about how this might compare to past anniversaries that some of you might have participated in or just had awareness about. And certainly a lot of coverage on NPR that day in schools across the nation and at different memorial sites. Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you all for sharing that with me. I'm always so curious just to know, what my audiences have been exposed to or what they've been thinking about before I start to share, some of the material that I put together for us to think about tonight. So thank you all for being such willing and, wonderful participants in that way. Okay, and as Amy said, as I'm talking you through some material tonight, please do feel free to put questions in the chat as I'm speaking, and we can always just pause and talk about those too. All right, so in my session for you tonight, what I really want to think about is, first of all, some of the things that I observed related to this 20-year anniversary of 9/11. And then to kind of step back and think about how that relates to some of what I saw during my field work, which I'll tell you more about, that took place from 2010 to 2015 at certain sites in Lower Manhattan. And from there, what I'd really love to do at the end of our session is to kind of open it up for a shared kind of reflection on how does all of this kind of compare to what we're seeing in our culture today as we're trying to work through the difficulties and in many ways the trauma of the global pandemic. So are we seeing similar strategies that people are using for coping with the present moment compared to what we saw with 9/11, or do we think it's radically different or somewhere in between? Okay. So I wanted to share with you just some, I think, really powerful images that I was parsing through as I was thinking about the way that 9/11 has been commemorated this year on the 20th anniversary. So one of the first ways that I personally became aware of some of the commemoration activity that was happening was when my partner told me, my partner's a big sports fan, that every single, sports team, that had national news coverage on that day seemed to be marking in some way, the 9/11 attacks and the 20-year anniversary. So what you're seeing here are fans at a Mets and Yankees game who are honoring the memory of 9/11. So you see certain people wearing special jerseys, a lot of sports commentators just remembering the attacks and their kind of impact in their commentary, really across sports in the United States on the 20th anniversary. So this is one example that kind of how this has infiltrated other parts of our culture outside of memorial sites as well, right? Good. Okay. We also saw, as one of you noted in your comments in the chat, there's obviously a big commemorative celebration or kind of memorial service that's held at the National 9/11 Memorial and Museum, which is located in New York. This takes place every year. So this was one of the kind of most publicized images from that ceremony. This year, you see past and present US leaders attending this ceremony, where the tradition, there's many parts usually to the ceremony that's held, but the tradition is for the names of the nearly 3,000 people who were killed on 9/11. All of those names are read out loud at the site in New York, usually by family members or people who had personal relationships with the deceased. So you see a wide range of different leaders kind of gathered to participate in that ceremony in New York. At the same time that we see this kind of national commemoration or this national memorial service playing out at the kind of epicenter in New York City, at that same memorial site throughout the day, you also have these very kind of intimate and private moments where family members who lost loved ones are also visiting the names of their loved ones at the memorial and placing flowers, placing mementos to kind of mark their personal loss and their personal connection to that site as well, which is something I'm going to talk more about in terms of when we think about what do these memorial sites mean to those who had family members or just personal loved ones or friends who were lost that day. It can sometimes hold a national or kind of, broader collective significance when we think about these sites. And it can also at the same time, or sometimes in tension with that, right, hold individual and personal meanings to be able to embody these spaces. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the material to follow. All right, what else did we see? For those of you who are familiar with Lower Manhattan, there's also a site right near the World Trade Center site that's called St. Paul's Chapel. This was a place where many rescue and recovery workers were able to go and rest, to lay down on the chapel benches, to get a little bit of water, a little bit of self-care during their time, the cleanup of Ground Zero. And even today, that chapel remains a place where people will go as part of their kind of 9/11 commemorations. So this year you see an image of people tying ribbons on the fence, sometimes with messages or names kind of inscribed on those ribbons as a way of marking their personal remembrances of 9/11 as well. So St. Paul's Chapel was one of the few sites near the original World Trade Center site that wasn't destroyed when the towers were collapsed. And a lot of folks that I talked to who are religious or kind of come at this from a perspective of faith believe that it was somewhat miraculous that in the midst of all the destruction, this one small chapel was able to kind of persist and stay standing. Okay. There's also, more recently, we're seeing a turn toward the combination of memorialization and calls to action or kind of activism that's emerged in relation to 9/11 as well. So what you're seeing here is an image of a speech and a ceremony that was meant to remember the Windows on the World employees. Windows on the World was a restaurant that was located at the top of one of the towers. The staff who worked there was extremely international in its kind of demographics. And nearly all of the staff members who were working that day ended up losing their lives because they were located so high in the tower. It was on one of the top floors of one of the towers. There was a few folks who were down below for various reasons that day who were able to survive. So more than 70 people from Windows on the World lost their lives on 9/11. But thinking about this kind of opportunity that we're seeing here to not only remember those who once worked for this restaurant, but to think about how can we collectively use this as a call to action to promote better wages, especially for service workers who, if anything has really emerged about our understanding of the lives and the realities of the global pandemic, we're, I think, maybe more increasingly aware of some of the challenges, right? And the sometimes forms of oppression even that we see in the service industry today. So this is Hillary Clinton giving a speech as part of that remembrance as well in New York City. Okay, so when we think of 9/11, many of us, or at least I personally, often immediately think of New York City as the kind of epicenter of what took place in 2001. But as I think most of us are at least loosely aware, there are other sites of remembrance as well that are tied to the history of what happened that day. So what you're seeing here is an image that comes from Shanksville, Pennsylvania. This is the site of the National Flight 93 Memorial. And you're seeing friends and family members who are gathered at a special site on that particular memorial's grounds that marks the site of impact where Flight 93 actually hit the ground. So this is a memorial ceremony that was held this year to remember the 40 passengers and the crew members who died, basically overthrowing those who had taken over their plane, right? So it came down in this kind of field in the middle of Pennsylvania. I visited this memorial for the first time this summer, actually. If any of you have ever been there, it's in a pretty remote part of Pennsylvania, but it's a very powerful site. It's very interesting to juxtapose it with this and then the site in the Pentagon that we'll see in a slide in a moment here. But thinking about these different kind of sites that have cropped up and the cultures and the different visitors who go to these places, right, at different points in time, there's a lot of interesting comparative thinking that we could do there if we'd like to. Okay. And here is the last site that I just kind of referenced, which is at the Pentagon. So this is an image from the 20th anniversary as well. And what we're seeing is a flag that's marking the site of impact where the plane hit the side of the building at the Pentagon. And in the foreground, you're seeing the National Memorial that's located just outside the Pentagon grounds to kind of commemorate the lives that were lost there as well, right? So we're seeing all of these different sites of remembrance. We're seeing all of these different places where people are gathering and trying to remember and commemorate and come together as community to reflect 20 years later and think about what does all of this mean, right? So as we're thinking about all of these images and all of this stuff that I'm kind of throwing at you, I guess I kind of want to turn to start to think about where does my interest lie in all of this landscape that we're starting to think through together. For me, when I think about these scenes that I've been showing you in these really powerful images, these are sobering and kind of somber images, right? As we're remembering those whose lives were lost. And yet in some ways, they're also maybe not unfamiliar to us, right? Over time, as a nation and as individual communities, and even as individuals or families, we have designated certain spaces, certain rituals that kind of guide our commemoration of this tragedy today, right? My own interest in my own fieldwork was really thinking a little bit more about the responses that emerged more immediately after this mass tragedy. So thinking about those early attempts to try and reforge viable lives, these early attempts for communities to come together and negotiate what is the memory of 9/11 going to look like. And these early attempts to kind of find meaning in the wake of something that was for so many people devastating and crushing and traumatic, right? So, I share all of these images and these reflections about the 20th anniversary, partly to say that the stuff I'm going to be talking to you about is a little bit more focused on when all of this was in flux, right? When a lot of communities were still negotiating and building these sites of remembrance and thinking through what are the annual commemoration ceremonies going to look like, and so on and so forth. So what I'd like to do with the remainder of my talking time for tonight is tell you a little bit more about the site where I did my own field work, and then to focus in on kind of three core phenomena that emerged during the course of my field work as strategies that I saw people turning toward as a way to work through what they had experienced on 9/11 or in its aftermath. So I'll tell you about my fieldwork, and then we're going to focus a little bit on the phenomenon of storytelling, on walking and walking the grounds of the memorial sites, and then on the act of memorialization itself. And I think / hope that this will set us up for a meaningful conversation about some comparisons that we might make with the present situation and the ongoing global pandemic today. Okay. Amy, are there any questions or things that we want to raise from the audience before we move into the next part? I think you can see the chat and the hand raising a little better than I can, but so far so good, or anything we want to pause for?
So far, so good.
Awesome. Okay. All right, so let me tell you a little bit more about the situation where I did my first kind of major study. This connects in a lot of ways to later studies that I went on to do in other contexts, which I'd be happy to tell you more about if you're interested in that. But my first major project, my dissertation and my graduate studies were really centered around this site that was then known as the Tribute World Trade Center Visitor Center, and then it later became the Tribute Center. And this is a site that emerged actually prior to the development and the building of the National 9/11 Memorial and Museum, which, if any of you have been to New York City in recent years and visited the World Trade Center site, that is a massive complex, right? It's a really beautiful memorial and museum that's been built up. But it took a long time, right, for that site to kind of take form and then be built and be approved, and for all the exhibits to get built in that massive underground memorial space and museum space. So the Tribute Center emerged earlier in the 2000s, and it was really a grassroots effort that was led by family members and others who had either been there on 9/11 or who had lost people who they cared about deeply in the attacks. They realized that until this national site is to open, that the community, the global community, but also the local community, needed a place where they could go and kind of process and learn about the history of 9/11 and share stories, and have a kind of focal point for thinking about memorializing and teaching about this event. So this is a site where, more specifically, certain groups such as survivors, first responders, local residents, and rescue and recovery workers were able to come, and they would lead walking tours around the emerging complex, right? So the ever evolving at the time World Trade Center site. So my fieldwork was between 2010 and 2015, so partly before the National Museum opened and then partly after, to kind of see that transition and what it was like at Tribute as well. And I spent a lot of time just observing kind of what people did at the site, how they moved through the exhibit spaces, what sorts of questions they asked, going out on the daily tours that were offered, And then I conducted interviews, in-depth ethnographic interviews as well, with about 36 people who were part of the tour program. So some of these were folks who were regular tour givers, regular docents in the program, sharing their stories. And others were people who had maybe done it a little bit or who had even left the program for different reasons, which we could also talk about. Some of the reasons why things that once worked for people sometimes no longer did, right? So I did these in-depth interviews, I shadowed a whole bunch of tours, and I analyzed the exhibit spaces as well. Okay. So yeah, that's just a little bit of context about my field work. And like I said, what I want to focus on for the next little piece here is 3 core phenomena that I observed at Tribute. And what I'm going to do is kind of combine some of the theoretical works that have helped me understand some of these phenomena with quotations from the people who I interviewed. So you'll get a little bit of a taste of the theory and a little bit of the on-the-ground kind of ethnographic stuff that I was exposed to through these conversations and interviews. Okay. All right, so the first thing that I want to focus on as a core theme is this theme of storytelling. So the image that you're seeing on the screen here is an image of one of these tour groups that's out with a Tribute docent. And as part of these tours that were given on the site, docents would share a little bit of the history of Lower Manhattan. So it's kind of evolution leading up to the building of the World Trade Center, what the World Trade Center kind of symbolized for people living in the city and more broadly across the United States and world when that complex existed, and then the kind of timeline of events that took place on 9/11. And throughout each of the tours, the docents would also pause and they would give an approximately 5-minute version of their story, their personal story, of how they were connected to what happened that day. So as I mentioned just a minute ago, in order to be eligible to become a docent, you had to kind of fall within one of these categories of survivor, first responder, local resident, or rescue or recovery worker. And then they would occasionally make other exceptions, but those were the kind of 4 main categories that people would fall into. So, guests will go out on these tours not knowing, what the story is that these people are bringing into their tour experience. Each tour would usually have 2 docents who would go together. So there'd be a lead docent and then a support, and both of them would typically share their stories as part of the walking around the site together. Okay, and just a little bit of context for how the stories themselves are developed. Tribute would hold weekend training programs for anyone who was interested in becoming a docent. Docents weren't paid, they were just volunteer positions. So it was people who were really interested either in giving back to their community, in remembering someone who they lost that day, or who, for one reason or another, just felt it was important to be part of this program and share their story. So these weekend trainings, people would come together in small groups. So groups of maybe about 10 to 12, maybe 15 people would come for a weekend, a 2-day event. And excuse me, at the training, Tribute staff members would help folks think through what is the kind of one core story that you are going to share on your tours, right? Many people who kind of go through the tour program and the docent training program would initially come in feeling very overwhelmed by their own memories, right? They would feel like there are so many things that they felt they needed to say or that they should say if they wanted to do justice to their memories of 9/11. So the purpose of the training program was to walk people through in a very kind of structured workshop. How can we identify just a 5-minute snapshot of your story that is accessible and understandable to those who are visiting and attending your tour? Okay, so as we start to think about what's going on with storytelling, you'll see a few of my favorite theorists will appear in our talk tonight, one of which is Hannah Arendt, who's written a lot about themes of storytelling. And her book, The Human Condition, is one that I've returned to time and time again in thinking about my work on trauma and kind of religion in the wake of mass tragedies of various sorts. And in The Human Condition, she writes a lot about the experience of pain. And she says that great pain is the least communicable of human experiences. It's deeply internal, It extends beyond words, and it can serve to isolate individuals from their communities. So I wanted to start with this in terms of theoretical works, because one of the things that Arendt is calling our attention to is that when something horrible or traumatic happens to any of us, we often feel very alone, right? That maybe there's no one else in the world, we think at least, who can understand what we've been through. And for a lot of the docents who came to Tribute's program, that was the kind of mentality that they brought to, of wanting to connect, but also just feeling so alone in what they were working through in their personal lives and experiences. So in terms of some of the things that I heard from docents, this is a quote that I've come back to quite a bit in my thinking about what does this tour program actually mean to people who are part of it. So this is from a docent who was a rescue and recovery worker who spent a lot of time just clearing out the wreckage that was in Lower Manhattan at the World Trade Center site. And this was someone who felt a very powerful connection to the site and to the community that he was actually able to forge while working on doing that cleanup work. So all of the other rescue and recovery workers, he kind of talks about as his brothers and sisters. For those of you who are familiar with the work of Victor and Edith Turner, thinking a lot about Communitas and this kind of very special community that emerged during a time of grief and during a time of transition for him and for other people. And he talked to me a lot in our interviews about how difficult it was for him to leave that cleanup effort and then go back to his regular life in New Jersey. So this is just one quote from that interview. He says, "I'm truly blessed with my wife, my children, my friends, but there comes a point where you can't keep talking about 9/11 with what I call the outside world. A lot of people don't want to hear about the World Trade Center anymore. They have the mentality that life must go on, that I need to stop talking about it and just focus on going ahead with my life. Whereas I feel that I shouldn't dwell on it, but I also shouldn't forget it," right? This was something I heard from more than one person who I interviewed throughout the course of my field work. This particular gentleman, just felt so alone, like he had all these stories that he needed to hold in, right? Because others were not receptive to hearing them. They didn't want to, in their minds, keep rehashing what he had been through or what he had seen or the sorts of things he was exposed to, during that rescue and recovery effort. So part of what he goes on to talk about is how meaningful it is for him to be able to share his story with these audiences who come to Tribute from across the globe to go out on the walking tours, who are so fixated on every word that he has to share, right? So he talks a lot about how meaningful it is to feel valued and to feel like he has a space where he can tell his story. Okay. All right, to build off of that a little bit, Michael Jackson, who's an anthropologist of religion and existential phenomenological anthropologist to be exact, and my former dissertation advisor, has also written quite a bit on the politics of storytelling. I know some of you are familiar with his work as well. And this is one quote that I found helpful in relation to some of the material I wanted to share tonight. Jackson writes that storytelling does not necessarily help us understand the world conceptually or cognitively. Rather, it seems to work at a proto-linguistic level, changing our experiences of events that have befallen us by symbolically restructuring them. Okay, so what's that mean? My interpretation of what Jackson is saying here is that when we tell stories, we're really trying to make a narrative out of something that might feel chaotic or that might feel kind of overwhelming. And in doing so, we're restructuring our very experience of what we've been through, right? When I teach on this sort of material with my students, I always tell them, think about if you've had a really bad day and you go home, right? And maybe you talk to your roommate or you talk to your parents or you talk to a friend and you just feel this impulse, or some of us might feel this impulse to just tell them everything you've been through that day and how horrible it was. And, how your boss was being really mean to you. And then someone didn't show up to work on your group project and you were so upset about it, right? And, what does that that process doing for us? It's not changing the fact that we've had a really awful day, but there's something meaningful about being the narrator of those events and kind of putting them through our own lens, right? And sharing them out with others that at least changes, maybe at some level, our experience of what we've been through and our ability to share that with other people. So I saw this as something that was really relevant to other things that I've heard from family members also who attend these trainings at Tribute. This is from a docent, a family member who lost her nephew in the 9/11 attacks. And just to give a little bit of context for this quotation, her nephew is someone who was in the towers. When they came down, he was able to get out, a couple of very short phone calls, but for the most part, family members were not able to communicate with him while he was trapped in the towers before they came down. And so she, going into this training, had just spent years kind of ruminating and wondering, was my nephew one of the people who had jumped from the buildings or not? Did he suffer? Was there like this prolonged suffering that he was experiencing throughout those hours of kind of waiting, or those minutes of waiting for the towers to come down? Did he have hope? Did he not have hope, right? So these were questions that she had held onto for years, right, before she came to participate in Tribute's program. So she said to me in an interview, I was there for her training, and then she spoke to me about it afterward. She said, the weekend that I came to Tribute for the training, I was still trying to piece together the details of my nephew's death in my mind. But at the training, I spoke to survivors who were there, and to this one gentleman, a first responder, who told me that my nephew couldn't have jumped. And then she kind of goes on to explain a little bit more about some of the things he said architecturally about, where her nephew's remains were found in relation to the way that the building fell. And he basically said, well, based on where your nephew was found, there's no way he could have jumped from the towers, right? She goes on to say, I connected with what must have been going on with all of these people who realized they were in dire straits. It was so comforting to know that some of them had had peaceful thoughts. So the other people that she was able to talk to at the training were people who were there who had actually survived, unlike her nephew. And she heard from a lot of them just about what their internal kind of dialogues or thoughts were as they were kind of trapped or not sure if they were going to survive. And hearing from some of them, at least, that they'd had peaceful thoughts about how they had lived good lives, or they were just thinking about the people who they loved, right? That really brought her a lot of peace. So if we think about this in relation to the Jackson quotation that I just shared with you, does this change reality? No, right? At least it doesn't change the fact that, her nephew's life was lost on 9/11. But what it does change, or what it does start to at least shift a little bit in her mind, is her own understanding of what he might have been through that day, or her own imaginings about his experiences throughout 9/11. And for her, this is tremendously kind of cathartic and meaningful to be able to not have full answers to those questions, but at least have new ways of thinking about them, right? Okay. So I've been talking for a while about storytelling. Could have had a whole hour-long presentation just about that. A lot to be said there. But I did just want to provide a couple of other snapshots into other phenomena that I was thinking about as really meaningful across this docent program at Tribute. So the next phenomenon that I wanted to talk with you about is the actual physical act of walking. So as I mentioned before, there are these walking tours that are part of the Tribute program, still ongoing today. If you were to go and visit Lower Manhattan, you could go out on one of these tours, at least in normal non-pandemic times. So these walking tours, when the program first started at Tribute, people would walk around the perimeter of the World Trade Center site because it was still under construction. So they would walk through kind of all the surrounding buildings and the neighborhoods with an eye toward the World Trade Center site as they were walking and explaining and kind of sharing their stories. Once the National Memorial Site in the plaza in New York actually opened, the tours shifted and people started actually going out onto the Memorial Plaza as part of the walking tour. So the route changed over time. There's a lot we could unpack in terms of what that shift meant for some people. There were some people who stopped giving tours because they felt it was too difficult to walk on that site, on that particular piece of land where the towers came down as opposed to walking on the perimeter. And then there were some people who found it was even more meaningful for them to be able to give tours now that the walking tour was going through those particular parts of the site. So to think a little bit about this theme of walking, just a couple of things that I wanted to share. I'm going to go back to Michael Jackson again for a minute here. This quotation is thinking about the embodied effects of trauma and the way that trauma lives not only in our minds and in our kind of mental schema, but also in our very bodies and in the way that we kind of hold ourselves and walk and kind of navigate the world around us. So Jackson writes here that terror consists not only in a crushing sense of being powerless to act or to make the slightest impact on one's external situation. It arises out of one's immediate subjective inability to control one's body, paralyzed or shaking with fear, and one's inner emotions. So here, what Jackson is talking about is that for many people who experience all sorts of different types of trauma in our world today, there is this sometimes embodied sense of powerlessness that comes with that, right? You can imagine that for folks who were perhaps trapped in the towers or who were not able to easily escape on 9/11, even if they survived, that feeling in their bodies of not being able to control or have full control, at least, over their freedom or their ability to flee, right? That's one example of what this can kind of look like when we think about how trauma can become embodied, right? In other cases, people who were just so shaken with fear, right, that they were unable to move in that sense, right? So as we're starting to think about bodies, I think this is an important aspect as we turn to think about walking as well. Okay. So this is a quote from a family member, also a docent at Tribute, who was talking about this impulse to keep moving after 9/11. So this is what she has to say. She says, "It's always been important to me to keep walking, to keep moving physically when I am giving tours. When 9/11 first happened, I walked for days. I drank water and I walked for days. I just somehow had to keep moving. In fact, when there was construction that prevented us from physically moving around the site, the World Trade Center site, I had to stop giving tours." So this impulse toward movement is something that I think is really fascinating, that for those, whether they were paralyzed with fear while watching what was playing out on television or actually physically there at the World Trade Center site, that physical inability to move or to do something in response to what was happening on 9/11 led a lot of people to prioritize walking and movement as a really important kind of way of coping or working through what they had experienced that day. I don't think this is entirely dissimilar from what we see with a lot of kind of more conventional religious practices too. The practice of pilgrimage, of moving together, of walking with a community, of visiting important sites, right, that are central to a given tradition. I see that as not dissimilar, right, from what a lot of docents are talking about in this context as well. Okay. Another thinker, Rebecca Solnit, has written a lot about the relationship between walking and memory. Her book, Wanderlust, I think is absolutely fascinating. It's very accessible to non-academic audiences as well. So if this is of interest to you, you might want to check out her collected works. But she writes that to walk the same way is to reiterate something deep. To move through the same space the same way is a means of becoming the same person, thinking the same thoughts. I've been thinking about this quote a lot recently because I recently, as I mentioned at the start of the program, returned to my hometown where I grew up. And I find myself walking certain routes or walking through certain places that are kind of embedded in the way that I remember and imagine my childhood. And it really does serve sometimes to kind of take me back and put me back in a certain moment, right? In a way that for me is very positive and kind of affirming of who I am today. When I read Solnit's quote here, it makes me also think a lot about that sometimes we walk through certain spaces in order to change our memories of them, right? That sometimes we revisit sites that were difficult for us or traumatic for us as a way to kind of reassert, I'm a different person now today, or just to kind of assert our very survival over the circumstances that we found ourselves in at that time. So it's almost the other side of the coin of what Solnit is talking about here. So this is a quote from a first responder, and she reflects on the first time that she and her husband, who was also a first responder, went back to the World Trade Center site since 9/11. So she says, the first time that my husband and I went back to the World Trade Center site, we had to leave because he became overwhelmed. We had to walk out of an event. He just drove in silence and then said to me, "I've not taken that walk since 9/11. That was the first time he opened up to me, the first time I got to see that side of him, because otherwise he did not talk." So this is a couple who both members of this relationship had been through extremely devastating circumstances on 9/11. And for years, they never talked to one another or other members of their family about what they had been through. So what she's emphasizing here is that it's actually the return to the space and the walking through and then out of an event that was held at this space that actually started to open up conversation between the two of them. In later parts of the interview, she said that this is really when their own relationship started to heal in a certain way, because they did start to talk. But it was through the physical experience of being there together and then starting to remember and then starting to open up to one another that they start to kind of shift their memories of what it meant to kind of walk through that site previously and then to walk through it together today. So there's much more we could say about that, but for the purposes of time, I'll keep going. Okay, so the third point that I just wanted to touch briefly on, and then we'll make sure to save some time for our conversation about kind of the current situation with the pandemic and some of the themes that we might see there. I also wanted to talk just a little bit about the very act of memorializing, whether that is on a small and kind of personal scale. We see this, often roadside crosses and things like that in our culture today, marking the site of an automobile accident. We also see huge national memorials and monuments to mark different sites of, collective importance in different ways. And to think about what does it mean to actually create museums and sites of memory that are simultaneously individual and collective in terms of their significance for people in the United States and across the globe today. So thinking about memorializing as our last key theme. Okay, so another scholar whose work I really admire and appreciate and have found inspirational for my own studies has been Edward Linenthal. And he's done this study about the Oklahoma City bombing. He's done other work surrounding the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And what I love about his work is that, very similar to what I'm interested in, he's interested in the creation of sites of memory. So how was the Oklahoma City bombing National Memorial and Monument, how was that created? And what was the process that the community went through to actually build and negotiate and figure out that site and its exhibits together? So one piece of what Linenthal has to share with us is he says, many involved in the memorial process speak of the journey that they took together, about the evolution of so many individuals into a working, bereaved community. So what I'm hearing, in my reading of Linenthal's work and what he goes on to exemplify throughout his broader writings is that memorialization as a form of activity provides an opportunity for community members who might, as I was saying before, feel very isolated or kind of separated from others in the wake of an attack or some sort of devastating event. It provides the bedrock and the opportunity for people to kind of come together, to engage as a community, and to figure out what are we going to do collectively moving forward? How are we going to remember? What might that look like? And so he's saying here that this journey that he saw in Oklahoma City was of individuals learning to come together to create a working bereaved community, right? The image that you see on the bottom of this screen is from a site in Staten Island where I visited a few times with one of the docents who I worked with extensively on my own research. This is a site called Angel's Circle, where people just kind of began spontaneously in the wake of 9/11, putting up little photos, little images of angels in this one kind of traffic circle, like a garden in the midst of a traffic circle. And over time, this became a formally established memorial and kind of site within Staten Island. So now it's kind of more formalized and recognized today. But it's that same sort of impulse of individuals seeking connection, coming together, and then building something, some sort of site or memory collectively out of that as well. Okay. So this is a quote again from a family member on the left side of the screen here. And she says, "Today is a special tour for us. It would have been my sister's 60th birthday. I like to leave little things for her when I visit the memorial. So today I made a birthday card that I'll leave near her name. My sister's body was never recovered. So as far as I'm concerned, she still resides there. When I'm out on the Memorial Plaza, I feel her spirit so strongly. It's like she's next to me." So this is, really speaking to that individual connection that a lot of people that I interviewed felt with the site, those who had lost loved ones or family members as a result of the attacks. For many of them, feeling like this is the space where they go to connect with the person who they lost. So we see tons of people bringing mementos, bringing birthday cards, flowers, flags, bringing very personalized items like a favorite pair of sneakers or a basketball, things that were really connected to the person who they lost, and leaving those at the memorial as a way of connecting with the person that they're remembering and wanting to be close with. So we see that kind of individualized or personal kind of connection on the one hand. And then Tribute also invites and kind of encourages people as part of their, experience of touring through the museum and its exhibits and its spaces. They invite all guests to share out their reflections about 9/11, about actions that they could take in the spirit of 9/11 and the spirit of Tribute to help or educate other people kind of moving forward. And so what they've collected over the years is this tremendous archive of visitor response cards. So you see just a couple examples of these featured on the screen here. They actually published a book. I have a copy of it in front of me, so I'll hold it up in case you can see it. But they published a book a few years back called 9/11, The World Speaks. This is when they were called the Tribute World Trade Center Visitor Center. That's just a kind of collection of different visitor cards that they wanted to feature, kind of highlight in their publication. But it's an opportunity for guests to continually engage in the memorialization process actively, right? They can draw things, they can write things, they can write out, and they often do, memories of certain people who they were connected to who were lost that day. So even if you're not a docent, Tribute really tries to open up space for everyone to be involved actively in the memorialization process. So here we see some of the kind of broader and more collective forms of memorialization taking form too. Okay. And just a couple other short quotes that I wanted to share in relation to this theme of memorialization. This is from a family member at the opening of that National Plaza, that National Memorial Plaza in Lower Manhattan. He says, "My mother breathed a sigh of relief today. My brother has never been identified. We don't have any piece of him to bury. This plaza is as close as we've come to standing beside a grave," right? So for some family members, the memorial sites themselves become almost a surrogate cemetery, or, in their minds, a literal cemetery, the place where they can go to, again, connect with their loved ones, to feel that this is the appropriate place for them to be remembered and kind of honored, right? Another docent who I interviewed, the oldest docent in the program, at least at the time when I was doing my fieldwork, she was 88 years old. She would give tours regularly at the site, sometimes with her daughter, her surviving daughter, and sometimes by herself. But she had this one quote in an interview with me at one point where she said, "What am I supposed to do? Stay home and cry? There's nobody there to dry my tears." And that's just one of those quotes that stuck with me, thinking about this older woman, thinking about her desire to connect with people, not just to be isolated in her grief, but to have a space and a memorial site where she can go to connect with visitors, to share her story, to remember her daughter who was lost in the attacks, and to feel connected, right? To feel supported, right? To have someone there to dry her tears. So this and much more, right, I think is kind of built into the ways that memorials are serving a purpose in people's lives. So these are the kind of, main themes that I wanted to share with all of you tonight as I reflect back on my fieldwork and I think about what were the kind of processes or the rituals or the different things that people found to at least try to work through their grief or their experiences in the wake of 9/11. This certainly wasn't successful. These strategies for everyone who was part of the docent program. There are some people who felt that it was too overwhelming to share their story, or they didn't like walking on the site because they didn't like seeing how commercialized parts of Lower Manhattan had become again, and thinking about the gift shop, at the National Plaza and so forth. So there's some who said this isn't for me, but for those who stayed in the program, these were some of the themes that kind of came up time and time again in those interviews that I did. Okay, so kind of two broad takeaways that I see as cutting across the three phenomena that I've talked about so far in our time together. One of the things that I think all of these different forms of action were kind of doing for people, and I've kind of been hinting at this along the way, is they serve as a way for people to restore what in some cases were damaged intersubjective bonds. Okay, so what does that mean? In our culture, we tend to think of ourselves as kind of individual people, these discrete units almost that are kind of separate from the world around us, right? Intersubjectivity is a theory or a way of thinking about things that says, actually, I am deeply embedded and connected to these webs of relationships, right? I have relationships with my physical surroundings and the geographies that I'm part of, with other people. I'm part of webs of relationships with ideas, with animals, right, with places, and all this stuff, right? So we're kind of enmeshed, in these bonds and in these intersubjective relationships. And to go back to what Jackson and others were sharing with us in the quotes that I had before, that isolation that we feel in the wake of some sort of mass tragedy or some sort of global event can often leave us feeling like we are alone and that we are separate and that we're not part of these webs of relationships. So the phenomena that I've been describing, I think one of the things that they help people do is to reestablish those connections, or at least their awareness of those connections to these meaningful elements throughout their lives. Okay. The other thing that I would say is that for many folks who are part of tributes programs, they also allow people to start to cultivate a sense of agency in their lives. When we talk about agency, there's many ways we could think about this idea as well. But I think of agency as the feeling or the sense that one's actions matter and that you're not just simply an object of fate. Right? To say, for better or worse, that I can take action in my life and that I'm not just totally dictated by the events and the people and the things that are done to me. And so cultivating agency is a way of saying, I have some degree of power. And it's not always to say, once again, that you have full power over your life or the things that might befall you, but just to say that I can take action, and that those actions may at least change my inner experiences of the things that I'm going through. Okay. All right, so this is the part where I want to kind of give a chance to open it up. I think we still have a little bit of time left during our discussion for tonight. So I wanted to open it up just a little bit for us to think collectively about what here might or might not resonate in terms of what we're seeing during the pandemic, and maybe some of the ways that we ourselves are trying to cope with everything that this pandemic and the COVID-19 situation has kind of brought to our lives. So I'm going to invite you to do this thing with me. If you're game for it, I would love it. If you are, interested in participating, I think it'll be much richer for everyone. But I use this website or this program called Mentimeter with my students a lot. And what it allows us to do is to kind of build up an interactive word cloud together. And then we could use that maybe to inspire some questions or conversation if that's something that all of you are interested in. So the way that it works, it might just take a minute to kind of get it set up, but on your phone or your laptop or your tablet or whatever you're on right now, you can open up this website, which is www.menti.com. And then you can, once you're on the website, enter in our code for tonight, which is 62177895. And then when you get on the page, it's going to show you a prompt. I'll put it up on the screen in just a second, and you can type in your answers and they will start to populate in the word cloud. Okay, so 1 to 2 word entries usually work best. You don't want to have like a 10-sentence entry or anything. It's going to make the word cloud look a little weird. And you can enter up to 10 separate answers. And if you like someone else's answer, this is how word clouds work. The more often that a certain word is typed in, the bigger it will become on the screen, and we'll see how the word cloud kind of evolves. Okay. So I will do this along with you, and I'm going to put up the slide with our thing here. I see people are already putting stuff in, which is awesome. So our prompt is thinking about what are some of the ways in which you have coped with the difficulties of COVID-19. So what activities, rituals, etc., have you found helpful? All right, so I'm going to set a timer for a minute or so and just give you a chance to write things in. And again, if someone has put in something that resonates with you, you can enter in the same response and it'll kind of start to shift the words on the screen, and the more popular ones will become bigger. All right, so let me set a timer and I'll be quiet just for a minute and let you type. Okay. We'll take another 10 seconds or so if you're still entering anything in. All right, so we'll count down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Yeah, so we can all kind of look at this, just for a minute together here. But, the larger the word, that means it was more popular as a response. And the smaller word might mean that only 1 or 2 people put that in. Some of the more popular things, though, reading. I shouldn't be surprised that the Belmont Public Library group turned to reading as a coping strategy. But certainly a popular activity within this group during COVID times. Outdoor activities or getting outdoors. Perhaps the converse of that, donuts. So, I guess, that's a helpful thing to think about too. Sometimes our coping strategies aren't things that are necessarily healthy, right? In the context of my fieldwork, I certainly talk to a lot of people who turn to alcohol or who turn to, overeating or other things as responses to 9/11 too. And that was just how their impulse went there, as opposed to places that other people went in terms of how to get through what they'd been through. I see other comments about walking dogs, making connections with friends, or some related things like talking to one's wife, family game nights, online church services, long walks, being in nature, prayer, knitting, technology. Good, meditation, comedies, religious services, all sorts of things. Yeah. So I don't know, as I'm looking at this, we can kind of open it up for conversation, I think, in just a minute here. But as I'm looking at this, I'm seeing some similar impulses, right, to the sorts of things we've been talking about. Not exactly the same necessarily. And we're still in the midst of the pandemic now, right? It's not over and done with. So we maybe haven't memorialized or taken some of those actions that we saw with 9/11, but certainly the desire to connect with other people. And for some of us, the connection to moving and walking and kind of getting out of these spaces that might feel, if you've been working from a home office like me for the past 18 months, feel a little bit bit like I'm trapped, right? So that impulse toward movement, right? So personally, I'm seeing a lot of resonances with the sorts of things we've been talking through tonight. So thank you for sharing that with me. Okay. Amy, I think I'll stop sharing my screen and maybe we can just kind of open it up a little bit for some questions or comments or however you would like to do the last part of our session together. I would love that.
Sure. So the one comment so far, it was from a little while ago, just when you had the quote from Rebecca Solnit, someone said, "Love Rebecca Solnit," all caps.
As do I. She has another great book also. I think it's called The Paradise Built in Hell or A Paradise Built in Hell. And it's also about the aftermath of all sorts of different tragedies across time. So she's a great kind of political and cultural commentator. I find her work very meaningful, but she writes a lot even about, Dorothy Day, this leader in the Catholic worker movement, and how some of her work was inspired by the things that she saw in the wake of the San Francisco earthquake and the kind of unique community it was forged of people coming together and supporting one another, and how that kind of led her to some of the later work that she does, within the context of the Catholic Church and the Catholic worker movement. So anyways, just to build off that a little bit, I also love Rebecca Solnit.
So I guess I was thinking as you were talking, we talked about your background a little bit, but we didn't really talk about what drew you to this topic. Can you say a little bit more about how you chose this as a topic to study?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's one that I get a lot from my students also as they're trying to figure out what sorts of things are they passionate about, or for those who are in graduate programs, how are they going to pick a project that's meaningful for them? This is a project that kind of came to me in a weird way. So I had long been interested in questions about, communal responses to difficult circumstances. I'd done a lot of working in the field of Holocaust studies and kind of related fields as part of my graduate work. And, when I was in my master's program, I happened to go and visit a friend in New York City. And I stumbled across this tour. I stumbled across one of the tribute tours and really connected with the docent who was leading the tour that day. 9/11 was an event that was one of the formative events in my early life. I was in high school at the time, which probably tells you approximately how old I am or what my memories of that event might be like in certain ways. But it was really through that close connection with the first docent who I met that I really developed this interest just in learning more about what's happening here. What is this kind of grassroots museum and space that's emerging? And then I basically wrote to the Tribute Center and said, can I learn more? Would you be interested in having me come and intern with you for a summer or support your programs? So that's kind of how I got sucked into this world. That was a really meaningful project and community to be, connected with. So it's maybe not a satisfying answer. Sometimes people say, what is it like to study something like this, not having a personal connection, not having lost a family member myself. And I think in some ways it's a blessing and a curse, right? I mean, certainly thankful to not have lost anyone who I personally loved or cared for that day, but it allows me some sort of outsider perspective and maybe some degree of scholarly neutrality in trying to analyze kind of what I'm seeing in the field and what people are grappling with. And it also creates certain barriers, right? There were people who in the course of my field work did feel like who is this academic, wanting to study this stuff and wanting to interview us. And for those folks, I gave them their space and no one had to talk to me or, have me on their tours or things like that. And, different people were at different places, with their own, dealing with that aftermath as well. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but that's what I've got for you, Amy.
If that's the answer, then it's satisfying.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was remembering I was in college and I have several friends who are quite a bit younger than me and were in middle school and even elementary school, and I call them baby friends. And just their experience is so wildly different, their remembrance. And I also was a children's librarian for a very long time. And I am always aware when 9/11 comes around that now there's this whole generation that doesn't know anything really, and they might talk about it in school, but it's a historical event to them. Have you done any work or thinking about that generation is that part of why you're studying this and I guess sort of recording it, is for them to understand?
Yeah, I wouldn't say this is one of my strong areas of expertise by any means, but I'm certainly interested in, as certain events like this kind of recede into collective memory, and we do have these generations that don't have that personal memory or personal experience of something that for many of us is one of these landmark moments, right? Like, how does the collective memory or the framings of it start to shift, right? So I'm always interested not just in like what is remembered, but how is it ever evolving and being negotiated, and what's at stake for different people in those kind of commemorations or memories. So I wouldn't say I've done a lot of research to think about that in recent times. With a project like this, it's almost one where I had to tell myself, basically starting in 2015, while I might maintain relationships with certain people who I grew close with in the field, I can't spend the rest of my life on this one project, right? So as with anything, it's kind of like, okay, I need to think about what's the next phase going to look like for me too. So I do have many friends who are docents who I keep in touch with, but I wouldn't say I'm still active in this research in that sense of what you're kind of talking about. But during my time of field work, Tribute actually did a lot of programs for educators and for librarians and for others, because at that point in time, there was a lot of conversation about how do we talk to children of different ages about what happened on 9/11 in ways that are kind of trauma informed and appropriate for their ages, and so on and so forth. And a lot of those resources are still available through their website and through some of their other online platforms. I just think it's a question that cuts to the heart of many different types of events about what is appropriate to say to like a second grader when we're talking about this history versus a high schooler, and how can we help them, in both cases, think in meaningful ways about what happened without it becoming, terrifying or, upsetting to a small child, for example. So it doesn't surprise me that you're interested in such meaningful questions, but I'm glad that you are.
Yeah, actually, thinking about that, we're going to have a program next month for parents about how to talk to your kids about tough topics. And it kind of came out of this programming around 9/11, but we shifted it away from focusing on 9/11 to be a little bit more general and a little bit more like what's actually going on in the news today, because there's certainly plenty to talk about. Let's see. I mean, I could keep going. I've got a bunch of questions, but if anybody else has questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Let's see. Didn't see any when I looked a second ago. I was struck by some of the docents, what they said. So there was the docent who talked about her nephew's last moments and wondering what that was like, and they couldn't be in touch. And, we had cell phones and we had texting. But I think I learned recently that there were cell towers on top of the World Trade Center building. So that was a lot of why there was no communication for a while. But I do also think that technology has changed in the years since, and certainly smartphones. So now you can, use your data, and maybe it's different. And I was remembering during the Boston Marathon bombing how important Twitter was in particular. And Twitter is still the first thing I go. I'm like barely on Twitter, but it's the first thing I go to when there's something hyper local going on, because it's instantaneous and it's fast and it's like short snippets. So I'm wondering if 9/11 had happened today, if we would have a lot more memories of people's last moments recorded somehow and delivered later, maybe when phones came back online.
Yeah, it's such a good question / theme to be thinking through. And, in relation to my fieldwork, I wonder, even if we'd had, videos or more recordings or more communications, to what extent would that have actually brought people more peace, right? It's going to be diverse depending on what their experiences are and who it is that they were trying to connect with. But you're right that lack of easy ability to communicate, both for people who are in the planes and at kind of different sites, right, was just a different feature. If you visit Tribute's museum space, they have some of the voicemail messages that people on the planes and kind of in other contexts were able to leave for loved ones, and they're heartbreaking and gut-wrenching to hear these recordings of people's last messages to their family members and their loved ones. but many of them were grateful to have that. So whether across the board it would have been helpful to people's coping or healing or working through of this event is an interesting question. And I've been thinking a lot about technology and our use of it during COVID too, right? As we've also been, socially distant and isolated in many ways, at least in my community. I worked, as I said before, from my home office for the past 18 months. And for maybe 6 months of that, I didn't really leave my apartment very often, right? And I'm sure some of you have felt that too, in one way or another, of just feeling like I'm in this very small space and using technology as my primary way, like we're doing right now, right? To connect with people in the midst of this ongoing global pandemic. And I don't know. I don't know if our use of technology right now has always been healthy or helpful, but we're certainly using it, right? Yeah, that's such an interesting theme. Yeah.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of the pandemic thinking about how different it is from the 1919, 1920 pandemic, and we can stay in touch this way, and it's been really a blessing, but also, has other psychological effects.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to think about, I don't know, the loss of boundaries in terms of work-life balance that a lot of people have gone through. And just having access to technology doesn't mean that people's lives are easier either. Thinking about parents who are expected to work from home while managing, childcare and other things, right? So certainly, something that others weren't able to take advantage of, during the flu pandemic in the early 20th century or in other contexts, but it creates its own unique circumstances and challenges too. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. I was thinking about the docent also who said, I shouldn't dwell on it, but I also shouldn't forget it. And sort of at the risk of psychoanalyzing him, I was wondering if maybe he or others weren't or aren't able to forget it or stop talking about it. And he framed it as like, I shouldn't, like this is a choice I can make, but I think for some people they can't. Hopefully maybe 20 years later, they've figured out a way to move past it, but.
Yeah, and I don't know if people ever, well, at least if some people ever move past it, I think that people might develop strategies that allow them to go about their daily lives. But there are some folks who are going to want to return to this memory every single day in one way or another. And it's actually for this reason, Tribute would put a cap on the number of tours that docents were allowed to give each month. I can't remember what the number was, but it was somewhere between like 5 and 10, I think. So the idea was like, they didn't want someone to be signing up to tell their story every single day of the week or multiple times a day, every single day of the week, right? I think the staff was also aware that this is a really fine line, right? And we want to be able to have a venue and an opportunity for people to share their stories, but we also don't want to kind of put people in a place where they're stuck, right? Where they're stuck in their memories and they're stuck in the past in a way that might not be productive or helpful, that might only be re-traumatizing for some people, right? So I think that they were thinking along the same lines as you, Amy, about, how do we strike that fine balance of remembrance and commemoration without it becoming kind of the impulse that someone can't necessarily control?
Yeah. Well, I do want to leave some space in case other people have more questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you would rather talk or type it in the chat. I am going to put the link to our survey, our little feedback survey, if anybody wants to click on that and grab it before, because it'll go away when I close the session when we're all done here. But there's the link again. But yeah, if there are not any other questions, then I thank you so much, Kate. This was just a really wonderful talk. I really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate all of you showing up. And, it's now, 8:22 on a Tuesday night, and all of you are here talking with me about 9/11 and this really heavy stuff. So it really means a lot that all of you were able to be here tonight and, participate in the conversation and the word cloud and all of that. And every time that I talk this through with people, I think about new things and feel inspired in different ways by the questions that people bring and, their input and their comments. So thank you all. And thank you to the library for the invitation to join you tonight.
Thank you. All right. Good night, everyone.
Take care, everybody.